The following is an OPB original series.
Oregon Experience is a production of OPB in partnership with the Oregon Historical Society. Leading support for Oregon Experience is provided by the Harold and Arlene Schnitzer Care Foundation, Arlene Schnitzer and Jordan Schnitzer, and the Robert D. and Marcia H. Randall Charitable Trust, Fund for Lifelong Learning. Major support provided by the Clark Foundation. Additional support provided by the contributing members of OPB and viewers like you. Thank you.
Fairview was an institution for people with developmental disabilities.
It is important to realize that these people are relatively happy in the facilities provided by the state of Oregon.
I was lonesome. It just felt like a prison.
You have to follow all the rules.
Yeah. And on my work.
If you don't mind the rules, you're punished.
Yeah.
I was 15 when I went to Fairview.
We're people just like you are.
I think it's cruel. I think it's terribly cruel that we are broken this way, labeled this way.
We formed a little group called Mothers from Hell. There were high levels of abuse, mistreatment, restraint.
Not so happy when not love in Fairview.
If people don't know about Fairview, then we might be doomed to repeat it.
So these boxes came to my front porch, and it was kind of overwhelming to see cremated remains on my front porch. This is one of the canisters.
After her grandmother's death, Carrie Fairchild discovered a long-buried family secret.
They're my grandmother's brother and sister. There were 5 children in the family, and 2 of them lived at Fairview Training Center most of their lives. Curtis Shelley was born in 1908. He and his sister, Margaret Pearl, had a genetic condition called PKU, and they were losing their IQs as they grew older.
In the 1920s, the siblings were admitted to Oregon State Institution for what was called the feeble-minded.
My great-grandparents were fairly poor. And then when an official person, like a doctor, is telling them this is the best thing to do, you don't know how to take care of them like these institutions do. I mean, they kept them at home as long as they could, but that's what they ended up having to do. I think one of the reasons maybe that nobody knew about it is because it was so painful to talk about.
The siblings lived at the institution for 40 years until their deaths in the 1960s. Their cremated remains went unclaimed until Carrie discovered their existence through a state website and filled out the paperwork to bring them home.
I'd never seen a picture of them. I didn't get one with Curtis with the paperwork, but with Margaret, there's 2 pictures in her paperwork. And they're very sad. And I just wanted to hold her and pick her up out of that picture and hold her because she just looks so sad. And it just confirms my reasoning why I needed to bring them home. I guess one thing I'd want people to know is that they were people. And they were people that loved them, even though they were left there. They need to be with their family and know that they're not forgotten.
Institutions in their history were a place for a community to send somebody away.
What was then called the Home for Feeble-Minded was essentially to separate folks that we today would perhaps refer to as developmentally disabled for training.
Mental retardation is often detected early in life. It usually begins during pregnancy, at birth, or soon thereafter.
Educational films like this one about Fairview Training Center promoted state institutions. Today, these images provide a glimpse into a world hidden away from society.
Once detected, and the family agrees that their child needs institutional life, the local courts step in, or voluntary commitment may be arranged. After proper medical recommendation, the child is committed to Fairview.
For nearly 100 years, Fairview was the state's main institution for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities.
Fairview was acres and acres and acres. It was 28 cottages, I think. So it was really a big place.
They had huge buildings. It had 2 separate pools. They had the gym. The school was situated out there. It was like walking a university campus.
But through the years, vandalism, neglect, and fires destroyed the property. Eventually, the buildings were torn down to make way for new development. But from 1908 until its closure in 2000, roughly 10,000 residents lived here. The name changed over time, but one thing was consistent. It was almost always overcrowded and underfunded.
A waiting list of about 300 confront Fairview. A 2-year waiting period between the time of commitment and the actual admission of a patient to Fairview is not uncommon.
Generally, the government paid for the patient's care, with families contributing what they could for clothing and personal items. Sometimes residents only stayed through their school years. Others lived here a lifetime. Many staff members spent their entire careers here and said they felt that the people they cared for every day were like family. But for some residents, Fairview was a prison.
I've been here about 7 or 8 years.
Linda Gear entered the institution as a teenager. She says she went to Fairview to make friends, but quickly regretted it.
I thought it was going to be really cool, but it wasn't. When I got out of Fairview, I was very happy. And it was like a whole new world opened up to me.
Linda is just one of many former Fairview residents who now live on their own and have become self-advocates.
I'll move there.
But you guys are all his friends.
Yeah.
Speaking up about their disabilities and their experiences.
We found out that Oregon got a special grant to help promote employment of people with disabilities. So, yay to Oregon.
With the support of a translator, Laddie Reed is active in the community as a forceful voice for equal inclusion. But he says at Fairview, no one listened to him.
A hell.
It was a hell. There was nothing good.
No.
If you were to go there,
One day.
you probably wouldn't last one day.
Today, an estimated 7 million Americans live with an intellectual or developmental disability, commonly referred to as IDD.
Yes, we were born with Down syndrome.
It encompasses a broad range of conditions. Each individual's needs and abilities are unique.
Come on, let's make some coffee.
In Oregon, about 30,000 people with IDDs receive some level of case management or support services from the state.
Can you take that and pour it in there? There you go. Good job. She's flourished and she's where she needs to be, and she's got one-on-one attention Oh my gosh, you can't get better than that. There you go. Okay, can you bring it over here?
A lot of the people that we serve now who are coming into the system, they're turning 18 and they've always known they would receive some level of support, which is uncommon. Most states don't have what Oregon has. Oregon is exceptional in this way.
But for far too long, in Oregon and across the country, there were very few options for people with disabilities. Labeled with archaic, often degrading terms, they were either put on display or hidden away from society entirely.
And one of the approaches was to remove people from the community into the institutions that were supposedly specially designed for their care. You started out having so-called insane asylums, and then also some schools for deaf children and schools for blind children.
In the 1870s, Oregon opened a school for the deaf, followed by a school for the blind. A few years later, Washington Territory created a school in Vancouver for what it called defective youth. Mental institutions began even earlier. In 1861, Dr. James Hawthorne opened the Oregon Hospital for the Insane in Portland, with the state paying for the care of what was called indigent insane and idiotic persons. By 1883, patients were moved to the new Oregon State Insane Asylum in Salem.
It's very important to understand that the Oregon State Hospital had many, many functions, and that people with conditions that we would never today associate with psychiatric care were there. The definitions of what we today would call mental illness were very vague. People who were considered different could often be committed to the state hospital.
The reasons for admissions varied. And ultimately, it's where many people with disabilities ended up, including children as young as 4 years old.
There was a movement among physicians and other activists to say, what about folks with developmental disabilities or developmental challenges? Should they be in the same institution as these many other people?
Behind the asylum walls, disabled children were housed with adults, some with severe or violent mental illnesses. The state often had no other option, especially when children were abused or abandoned by their families.
The time has come when the state should do something looking to the care and protection of feeble-minded children.
In 1907, the state appropriated money for a new institution for the training and care of what it called feeble-minded, idiotic, and epileptic persons.
The idea was that this would be a training institution so that those who were considered to be developmentally disabled would have training that they might be able to return to the community.
The state purchased nearly 700 acres of farmland just outside of Salem. Inmates from the state prison provided labor to clear the land for a working farm and build the facilities, including an administration building, dormitories, a laundry, and boiler house, large enough for about 200 residential patients. The first one arrived on November 30th, 1908, 10-year-old Jack Crawford. Like most of the first arrivals, Jack had epilepsy.
Epilepsy was uncontrolled and was actually considered one of the most incurable, dismal diagnoses to have. So some of the first admittees to Fairview were folks who had seizure disorders.
Of the people admitted to the institution that first year, several were transfers from the state insane asylum. The oldest was 88, but most were under the age of 21, including Roy Fifield. A newspaper article reported on his condition when he was committed to the asylum at age 5.
Roy has grown to the physical proportions of a youth of 18, while his mind has failed utterly in its growth. The hapless freak was taken into custody.
But Roy wasn't there long. He was soon released, and his name was later listed in the same paper for making the school honor roll. 16-year-old Addie Taylor was another first arrival who was soon released to her mother, eventually marrying and having a family, living a far different life than if she had stayed in the institution.
Basically, if you had a disability and couldn't advocate for yourself, you might wind up in Fairview at the time.
I remember meeting 3 siblings, and they had grown up at Fairview. I'm not sure any of them had an intellectual disability, but their family was poor, their mom died, they were probably never real educated, so people assumed they didn't have a lot of mental capacity, and they were sent to Fairview.
The story with families is complicated, I think. It was often an economic issue. A lot of these were poor parents from small towns all throughout Oregon. They would often write these letters saying, I really don't want to do this, but I don't know what else to do.
No matter why they were at the institution, they were all known as inmates.
I think inmates is the appropriate word. It captures the harshness of the environment better than I think residents or clients.
The institute was aimed at children, but it was designed for long-term care with imposing dormitories called cottages. Inmates were segregated by age, ability, and sex.
People often wanted to try and make it sound like this is, living in a college dorm. It was nothing like living in a college dorm.
You're living with anywhere from 40 to maybe 80 other people in the same large building, and you really don't have much control over your life in that situation. People tell you what your schedule is, when you're going to eat, when you're going to go to your activities. It's very industrial.
Inmates were issued clothing, given strict schedules, and punished for not following the rules.
There were many physical restraints that were used at this time in institutions. This could go anywhere from a straitjacket to bracelet restraints. There were some medications that were starting to be used.
These were really places of custody and control. It was more like a prison.
In 1910, the state was spending about 58 cents a day per person. The census that year lists about 180 inmates. Just over half were male. 75 students attended school. Lessons included math, reading, and personal hygiene. But officials considered the institution quasi-educational.
We are becoming more and more convinced that to spend years teaching a child reading, writing, and numbers is not only foolish, but a waste of time and money.
Boys worked on the farm, providing fruit, vegetables, poultry, and pork for the institution. Girls did the facility's laundry and sewed the clothing.
They tried to be self-sufficient while at the same time pleading for more money from the legislature.
From almost every report we have, there was never enough funding, ever.
Without the money for adequate staff, some inmates were responsible for caring for others, leading to accidents.
There were periodic investigations by grand juries. There were periodic investigations by journalists. But the day-to-day workings, there was not a lot of direct oversight.
Reporter Margaret Scavlin wrote dozens of investigative reports about forced commitments, noting the majority of the children were from poor immigrant families.
Poverty causes the social worker to regard a family with suspicion of feeble-mindedness.
Following the reports, Oregon Governor Julius Meyer ordered an investigation, but not much changed. Instead, a movement grew to rid society of those considered defective.
Once they have been born, defectives are happier and more useful in these institutions than when at large. But it would have been better by far, for them and for the rest of the community, if they had never been born.
Films like this one promoted the idea of what was known as eugenics, as a way to control and improve society.
Eugenics seeks to prevent the degeneration of the race and improve its inborn qualities.
Positive eugenics was the notion of having the best examples of humanity match up and have children that carried on those paragons of virtue. And then the negative eugenics was keeping the misfits and the threats to social order, keeping them from reproducing.
And so they did sterilizations without people's consent.
In the early 20th century, over 30 states passed compulsory sterilization laws.
There were even some examples that promoted euthanasia, not just sterilization.
The theory of mercy killing of the hopelessly feeble-minded is a fine thing in principle.
The eugenics movement grew in the United States, but was taken to its most horrific extreme in Germany. In 1939, Adolf Hitler signed an order allowing for involuntary euthanasia, termed mercy death, allowing doctors to kill people with mental or physical disabilities. It specifically targeted children. The idea was shocking, and to some, sterilization seemed reasonable by comparison. In Oregon, Dr. Bethenia Owens Adair was the driving force behind sterilization through eugenics laws.
She made many presentations and was really an advocate, and we would today use the term lobbyist.
Owens Adair was like a handful of other independent women leaders of the day, breaking trails throughout the West. As one of the region's first female doctors, she traveled the countryside serving the community. From Roseburg to Clatsop County in Portland, Dr. Owens Adair cared for patients around the state. By the turn of the century, she was an active leader in progressive politics.
She had a very strong role in Oregon, and she used her expertise and her reputation as a physician.
She felt that women's suffrage, prohibition, and eugenics would improve society.
She believed that it was humane to do so, that it was a way to say you can then be trusted to be in the community because you're not going to reproduce.
Owens Adair authored and promoted a eugenics law in 1907, but court cases and organized groups opposed the legislation at first. In 1923, Oregon enacted a eugenics law for the compulsory sterilization or even castration of people deemed feeble-minded, insane, epileptic, habitual criminals, moral degenerates, and sexual perverts.
The eugenics law eventually included terms like antisocial behavior or sexual deviancy. So this was a very wide net.
Inmates at all state institutions were considered candidates for sterilization, with a board of eugenics made up of state officials who had the final say. For decades, almost all Fairview residents had to be sterilized before they were released to the community.
They would often ask parents for permission or even the individual for permission, but that came with the message that if you don't say yes, they'll never get out.
It was a shame. They didn't ask people if they wanted to be sterilized, they just did it.
Laddie Reed was committed to Fairview in the 1950s at age 10. He was diagnosed with cerebral palsy and sterilized before his release in the 1970s.
A woman.
They did it to all the women, too?
A woman.
All the women were sterilized?
Nah.
They didn't ask the women either.
Before people got to go out in the community from Fairview, they would have to have a sterilization. every one of us.
Over 2,500 people were sterilized in Oregon before the law was finally repealed in 1983. Through the years, residents endured many violations of personal and civil rights.
One ward in Bird Cottage is for a group of patients who are both mentally retarded and psychotic. Until tranquilizing drugs were introduced, 2/3 of them were in restraint.
They gave me a lot of medicine, and I could not do anything.
A few unusual behavior problems need additional isolation to protect themselves as well as the other girls.
We all know about the film Cuckoo's Nest.
Oh, me, Chief.
Horrible things have happened to people in the words of sort of control and intervention.
Open your mouth.
The movie, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, was filmed at the Oregon State Institution. Based on the book by Oregon author Ken Kesey, it depicted his experiences working in an asylum. It included some of the most disturbing aspects of the institution, including shock treatments and worse.
Are you ready?
Lobotomies were used to treat mental illness by severing brain connections.
In the following procedure, the surgeon inserts the leucotome into the brain. His first move is to penetrate directly through the brain from one opening in the skull to the other.
In 1947, one of the first lobotomies in Oregon was on a 50-year-old woman from Fairview. The surgery was performed in different ways. The most infamous involved inserting an ice pick-like instrument into the eye socket. It didn't always work, but it usually left patients passive and compliant.
He'll have to be taught to feed himself, dress himself, and be toilet trained the same as a child.
The records are incomplete, but it is known that in Oregon, one patient was as young as 13. At least 2 died due to the operation. It was finally banned in Oregon in 1981.
It is astonishing to see decisions about treatment that really we today would not consider coordinated care in the least. The therapeutic strategies kept changing. There were water treatments. It was thought to be calming to be in a warm bath, but those sometimes were for 20 hours. So it's puzzling to think about how that might have been therapeutic.
In those years, lack of adequate staff made quality care almost impossible. One report showed that sometimes there was just a single employee to care for 85 residents. Conditions were unsanitary, and there were outbreaks of dysentery and meningitis. While electrical fires and broken water pipes further damaged old buildings. But by the 1950s, there was a push to modernize the facility.
Attaboy, Ramon. Do you like your shampoo?
Those with severe medical problems and the need for constant care find it within the confines of the state institution.
Institutions across the country tried to reinvent themselves as places for therapeutic care and treatment. In 1966, Oregon's facility was renamed the Fairview Hospital and Training Center.
That's a pretty girl.
This physical therapy class is an indication of just how far we have come.
Therapies like these were expensive and hard to come by. And state-run institutions remained one of the few places parents could get services for their children.
She's got the strength, especially when she's under a tantrum. She can really throw a lot of strength around.
Control of her.
It's really scary.
I was told a long time ago to put her away, but as you know, when you have your own child, you hate to put them away. So, but it's getting so I can't take it no more.
Thousands of families had no other options.
I remember going there and then living on the cottage because my dad couldn't take care of me. I was lonesome. It just felt like a prison.
Ruth now lives independently with her partner, Richard. Richard and his twin brother, Robert, also lived at Fairview in the 1950s.
Many moon ago. I got dumped out of bed at morning. I wake we up.
But Richard also has good memories, and his time at Fairview led him to his partner, Ruth.
We was young.
Young. Teenager. They were fun old days. Good old days.
I didn't like that many people down there.
Sherry Osborne entered Fairview when she was 5 years old after contracting a virus. She stayed until she was 18, but went home for visits.
I come home Friday, come back Sunday, but only thing when you go back Sunday is so sad. I didn't want to go back.
Many of the children go home for summer vacation. This return to the community is a big step forward in the struggle for understanding the mentally retarded, struggle being met with parent and community education by Fairview and groups such as the Oregon Association for Retarded Children.
The Association for Retarded Children is known today as the ARC and still exists as an advocacy organization. In Oregon and around the country, ARC groups formed in the 1950s with parents meeting to discuss their children's needs.
I am the parent of a mentally retarded child. In this county, we have no special classes, no nursery schools, no community or child guidance centers to give our children what parents of every normal child take for granted.
By the 1960s, parents' groups pushed for national laws protecting disability rights.
I have sent to the Congress today a series of proposals to help fight mental illness and mental retardation. These two afflictions have been long neglected.
I was just enamored with the idea that almost anybody could leave Fairview if we could figure out how to make it happen. I basically spent the rest of my career working in a variety of places to achieve that goal.
Molly Halsapple began working at Fairview as a college student.
By the end of the first year, could feel like if I hadn't been lucky, I could have been any one of those people.
Molly has limited vision and cerebral palsy. She made a deep connection with the residents her own age, especially after fire broke out in the summer of 1969.
I was sleeping in the staff housing and an alarm went off.
Bird Cottage was on fire. It housed nearly 200 people, many with multiple disabilities.
It broke out at 3 o'clock in the morning. And all I could do was sit up on my bed and, I want my mommy.
By the time we got there, it was pretty engulfed in fire.
People with the most severe disabilities were in adult-sized cribs, so big that they could not fit through the doors, leaving many residents trapped.
You could not wheel the crib through the door, so you had to take the crib to the door and then pick the person up and take them out, which was appalling and scary.
They got us out all right. And been 16 years old, and yeah, it was really scary.
3 residents died in the fire. Another 9 were injured. More and more, Fairview was seen as a place to be avoided as public scrutiny revealed long-hidden problems. Newspaper accounts from the 1970s show a wide variety of crimes, accidents, and injuries, as well as the rape and murder of a female resident. 3 other residents were charged but never stood trial. In 1971, Governor Tom McCall called for the first of a series of investigations.
Recent turbulences of Fairview, some imagined, some real, have taken their toll on staff morale and public confidence.
I think what was most disturbing, aside from the actual abuse itself, was the whole culture of letting it happen.
There were high levels of abuse, mistreatment, restraint. We have a lot of self-advocates in our community who truly suffer from post-traumatic stress.
Well, some of them couldn't talk, most of them. And when they did try to talk, you couldn't really understand them.
Those patients with the most significant needs were often the most at risk for neglect and abuse.
A rape, by definition, it couldn't be described anything else, it is in the hands of the state police, and we are cooperating with them every way we can.
In 1979, 2 bedridden women with significant needs were raped by a caregiver. He was a convicted sex offender employed at Fairview through a job training program.
She was very low communicating. She doesn't talk, so there wasn't really a way for her to advocate for herself if something was happening.
Amanda was born from that rape. She was adopted and only discovered this story as an adult. She eventually tracked down her birth mother, seen here with Amanda.
It was kind of surreal looking at this woman so petite and disabled and knowing that she gave birth to me.
Today, her mother lives in a care home in Portland, where Amanda says she is happy and well cared for.
The fact that she wasn't protected and that someone was allowed to violate her and do that to her, when I want nothing more than to protect Catherine because she can't speak for herself. Catherine is such a blessing to our family, and I think there's a lot of Catherines out there that can be blessings to their families.
The same year, 1979, another teenage resident disappeared. The body of Janie Landers was found near Silver Falls State Park.
The evidence clearly points and supports that on March 9th, 1979, Gerald Kenneth Dunlap murdered Janie Landers.
In 2017, the state police announced they had solved the cold case. DNA evidence indicated the killer was a Fairview employee with a previous record of rape.
I'm glad that we were able to bring the family some closure on this. They waited an awful long time to finally figure out what happened to Janie, and I was glad that we were able to bring that to her.
How many times do you think you ran away while you were at Fairview?
More than I could count.
He did more than I did.
These oral histories were recorded not long after the institution closed. They document residents' memories of their time at Fairview.
I thought, bars on the windows, I couldn't go anyplace.
They do anything to us. They could slap us, they could hit us, or they could do anything to us.
I was fighting these people off, and I got full restraints. I got the wet sheet.
Scald?
Scald them with hot water.
Wow.
They did. So most of the girls, they don't behave themselves, they get in there and scald them. Hot water.
Phil Ferguson interviewed former residents about their experiences.
Do you have any good memories of Fairview?
It was part of a project he and his wife Diane worked on to research and record the stories of Fairview.
The stories about the punishments, the terrible food, the hard work taking care of people with more significant disabilities in some of the cottages. I found it fascinating to listen to them and how strong their memories were of some of those stories.
I think us girls was scared.
Yeah.
You know, we were frightened and scared. If we say something, tell on somebody, we would get, in trouble.
The issue is both professional and personal for the Fergusons. After surgery as an infant, their son Ian was left with significant developmental disabilities.
We were told at the time that the best place for him was an institution. That was only 50 years ago. And it was the accident of a social worker who happened to come to our home who said, really, there's nothing they can do at the institution that you can't do as well or better here in your home.
In fact, exposés revealed that some institutions were doing the bare minimum to care for residents.
So unannounced and unexpected by the school administration, we toured building number 6. The doctor had warned me that it would be bad. It was horrible.
In 1972, Geraldo Rivera's investigative reporting on Willowbrook State School in New York exposed horrific conditions.
What we need is a new approach. We have to change the way we care for our mentally retarded. We ask for change, we demand change.
A series of lawsuits and new federal protections for people with disabilities followed. In Oregon, families and residents were also demanding change.
We're people just like you are, and everybody else. So they should give us the same consideration.
In the 1970s, Linda Geer and others with developmental disabilities started a self-advocacy group, People First.
People First was to help people get out of on their own and not live in a group home or a nursing home anymore.
I remember Linda as one of the leaders of a bunch of young adults. She was an adolescent, so she was a bit feisty.
We don't want to have anybody tell us what to do and when to do it, like what time you should go to bed and what time you get up. Of course, me, I'm not too good about getting up. And
People First held its first convention at Ottercrest in 1974. Over 500 people attended.
We may have some outside help with advisors and whatnot, but we want the main gist of the convention be run by us.
That meeting is generally considered the beginning of the developmental disability self-advocacy movement.
I think it's cruel. I think it's terribly cruel that we are spoken this way, labeled this way. To me, if you gotta label something, label words, label jars, label streets, but don't label persons. You put them down in the hole. And I'd like to see personally for a go for People First, and to get rid of mentally retarded, mentally disabled, mentally everything. Will the convention of the People First Round 2 please come to order?
Oregon was the first state in the nation to have a People First movement.
We want representatives on state DD council, developmentally disability. Do we want this? We want representatives on President Committee on Mental Retardation. Do we?
And that basically said, you don't need to call me mentally retarded. You don't need to call me other names. I am a person first.
Within the first 5 to 10 years, you had over 1,000 people saying they were part of People First in one state or another. And then by 1985, it was an international movement.
Self-advocates were speaking up, but most still weren't getting services. In the 1970s, Fairview was the state's largest institution for people with developmental disabilities, but it was only caring for about 3% of that population, leaving thousands of Oregonians with no government-funded supports at all.
We formed a little group called Mothers from Hell. And I was to go down to the legislature and be a parent advocate.
Parent groups pressured the legislature for better services in the community.
They also need to be able to go out in the community and live. And a group home is a safe environment to try that.
What should we start first? The hamburger first. Okay.
Lawmakers responded, asking the federal government for more flexibility in how Medicaid dollars could be spent.
Oregon was the first state to apply for a waiver that said, we'd like to use those same funds that we would be using for people in institutions and use them for people living in the community so that they don't have to go to an institution. That was a big game changer.
At the same time, Fairview began facing a series of lawsuits.
The ARC of Oregon filed a lawsuit against the state and then filed a federal lawsuit with the Department of Justice.
The U.S. Department of Justice came and did an investigation at Fairview and found conditions that were very abusive.
The federal government decertified the facility and withdrew millions of dollars in funding after an investigation revealed Fairview to be abusive and unsafe. In a single month, residents suffered over 600 injuries, and there were more than 25 reported incidents of sexual abuse.
Hello, I'm Jim Swenson, and let's take a look at a preview of tonight's stories. Oregon's Institution for the Mentally Retarded is under fire again. The federal government has demanded the state make changes, but will the plan get the job done?
The courts ordered Fairview to implement a comprehensive plan of correction, calling for the hiring of hundreds of new staff.
I started in 1985. The era changed at that point for Fairview, with all the new lawsuits coming in. And we were to monitor programs, review incident reports, just try to be in compliance with things at that point.
When I first started there, they were finally getting rid of certain things that they used to use back in the days of old.
It was the end of the use of straitjackets. Helmets were only used for patients that would fall. Everybody was working so hard to be better, and that was the goal of everyone.
She has no neck control, and we'll work on her neck control.
But there were still problems. In 1994, 14 employees were investigated for ongoing abuse. 11 were arrested.
Did we have people that were abusive? Yes, we did. But we also weeded those people out and got rid of them.
Teresa Messner and her sister both worked at Fairview, where a third sister, Thelma, was a resident.
Fairview had everything there. I mean, doctors, nurses, dentists, neurologists, they were all there on campus. And so we never had to really worry about her being taken care of there.
They were part of a Parent and Guardians Association that pushed back on plans to move residents into the community.
Besides being the chairman of the Fairview Parents Association, Bob Ogan and his wife also have concerns for their own mentally retarded daughter who lives at Fairview.
Most of the parents that I hear are saying, we have not found anything in the community that is superior to Fairview. And why should we accept something less than what we already have?
With more and more mentally retarded Oregonians being deinstitutionalized, there's a growing need for effective training programs and quality living conditions. But is the state meeting the needs of society's retarded?
A lot of the group homes out there weren't ready to house them and even know what to expect when they had behaviors in medical crisis. There was a lot of individuals out there that suffered because of that.
In 1989, at least one resident died within days of moving out of Fairview and into a community facility. Despite opposition from employees and parent groups, the state created a plan that would close Fairview for good.
It was as difficult, I think, for employees to see the institution change as it was for families. For many of them, several generations worked at Fairview. It was their world. It was their community.
I loved it there. If they wouldn't have closed it, I would have retired there myself.
Closing the institution meant drastic changes for thousands of Oregonians that depended on Fairview on some level. Nothing about it was simple.
My job was to close Fairview. Our lives were a lot of meetings. People were listened to. It wasn't consensus all the time, but I think it was important that their voices were a part of all of the development.
We'd have intense conversations, arguments, providers and families and the state. But we all had the same vision. It took over 10 years to close the institution. And so you have lots of versions of what went on and what pushed it. I think what really pushed it over the edge was the cost.
Different groups debated the numbers, but officially the state determined it was spending over $200,000 per resident each year, and that community-based care would be cheaper.
Aside from the money, it's just the right thing to do. People are having a way better quality of life in the community.
For years, the state worked with teams of community groups to find new homes for residents. Along with the services and caregivers they would need to be successful.
We did plans for every single person there, got to know what's important to them, what's important for them, and where are their families in the community, so where would they move back to.
Thelma moved out in December of 1999, and she was the last one on the cottage. She moved to the group home. It was a scary, scary time.
The group home didn't work, and her family removed her. Many residents and guardians struggled to find the right situation.
So everything was like a panic mode at that point until we found somebody that would take care of her while we were at work and things. And then we found this place, and it's been going ever since. Say, coffee time. Tea time. That's what she calls coffee, is tea.
The last resident left Fairview Training Center in February of 2000. There were both tears and celebrations.
I'm so happy when I left in Fairview. I'm glad I'm not there. I'm glad they closed.
I was really, really happy about that.
But for thousands of Oregonians with disabilities, there were still no services, even if they qualified for federal Medicaid.
80-year-olds taking care of their 60-year-old kids on wait lists and getting no services.
Again, a group of families sued the state, and Oregon settled. The Staley settlement opened new doors to Oregonians with disabilities, ultimately paving the way for what's known as support services brokerages, agencies that work with individuals to plan their own care.
We started to enroll people into supports who had been waiting a very long time for services. Now, people in our state can choose who they receive services from. They can choose who they hire. They can choose what services they get and when they get them.
It used to be that when people wanted to talk nationally about where is the DD system working, Oregon was always the model, always the model. They got it right.
And so now the conversation is really about what do you want to do with your life?
I like to live alone. It's kind of fun.
I felt good that I got to leave.
Former Fairview residents Ruth and Richard are now self-advocates and have been working with the group People First for decades.
People First banner I made. I did a good job.
And then I decided I wanted to be a president of People First of Oregon, and I got elected, and I did.
For Ruth, self-advocacy is an important way to share her story and speak out for all those with disabilities.
I was one of these people who got sterilized. My dad and I had to sign a paper that I did not understand until afterwards. I did not have a choice.
Making sure people know this history and these individual experiences has been important for many former residents.
People need to be listened to. And so, like I said, some of these people didn't get to be listened to.
Oregon Story is really important. Being able to share with new generations what has kind of come before them, I think is really essential for our community.
Before the Fairview Training Center was torn down, some young people from a local social justice organization toured the site to share their impressions for a video they produced.
This place is like shame for the kids.
I don't want to be locked up. It's very sad.
Hi, everybody.
They are some of the next generation of self-advocates.
I'm still learning what it means to have Down syndrome.
People like me are very passionate about fitting in and not to put a label on it.
I wanted to say, don't limit me and don't limit yourself. We can do this.
Just treat us like people, like human beings, because that's what we are, human beings.
There's more about In the Shadow of Fairview on Oregon Experience Online. To learn more, visit opb.org. Leading support for Oregon Experience is provided by the Harold and Arlene Schnitzer Care Foundation, Arlene Schnitzer and Jordan Schnitzer, and the Robert D. and Marcia H. Randall Charitable Trust, Fund for Lifelong Learning. Major support provided by the Clark Foundation. Additional support provided by the contributing members of OPB and viewers like you. Thank you.